Hello, I'm Gavin Clark, and I'm here with the National Museum of Computing, which is houses the world's largest collection of working historical computers. Every year, the museum awards an honorary fellowship that recognises outstanding contributions in computing and computer history by individuals. Past winners have included Margaret, who was recognised for her outstanding service to fostering and maintaining the memory of the achievements of the wartime code breakers of Bletchley Park. And she, of course, was married to the late Tony Sale, who was the founder of the National Museum of Computing, and his award was received posthumously. I'm pleased to be here with the 2020 winner, who is Professor Brian Randell, who is a distinguished computer scientist and a computer historian. Professor Randell's research led to the discovery of recognition of the importance of Colossus, and that information went public in the 1970s. His work at the time on uncovering Colossus and establishing it in the national consciousness was described as a major historical bombshell and led to a kind of reassessment of the importance of Bletchley Park. He also, of course, has the honour of being the youngest professor of Newcastle University, which, of course, where he's worked. Professor Randell, thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, hi.
So we, of course, want to see...
I perhaps was the youngest professor. I certainly am not now.
That's fine. We won't hold that against you. Congratulations on the award. Is it possible to see it, first of all? I understand it's quite an impressive piece to look at.
Yeah. It's a large chunk of glass with an engraving inside the glass.
Okay.
I'd not seen this sort of thing before, but if I turn it round, you can see things like that little emblem and my name are inside the glass. That's some sort of laser printing, if you like, three-dimensional laser printing. Very clever. Thank you very much.
Can we see it one more time? Back a little bit. That's brilliant. Look at that.
Right.
Yeah, that looks really good. That's it. Really perfect there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Great.
Right.
So obviously you're in some distinguished company and a very small band of people at the moment. There's a lot to talk about in your career. Not many people get these kind of awards. Tell us a little bit about I suppose the thing that really jumps to mind first of all is you obviously were important in helping establish getting Colossus out, the name out there. Not many people knew about it in the 1970s. How did you come to discover the story of Colossus, and why did you decide to champion the cause, I suppose?
I stumbled across Colossus when I was putting together a collected set of original documents in the form of a book. The book came out as The Origins of Digital Computers, Selected Papers. And the idea of the book was that it would cover from Charles Babbage in the mid-19th century through to the first electronic computers in about 1950. And somebody asked me why Turing was not in my list. And I said I'd not included him because his pre-war work had been on a very theoretical topic, and that didn't fit my book. And the post-war work that he had done on computing fell just outside the time frame I was talking about. So I was told, well, why don't you dig a bit more into what he was doing during World War II? And I did, and I managed to get enough people to be sufficiently indiscreet to allow me to write a paper which essentially had within it 1 page worth at most of information that Britain had an electronic computer called Colossus during World War II. About several years later, I managed to get permission to interview everybody. Sorry, not everybody, but the engineers involved in building Colossus. And the government then changed its previous decision and allowed the machine to be at least partly declassified. So that's what happened there. My first attempt involved a writing direct to the Prime Minister, and for a while I was possessor of a letter from the Prime Minister to me, probably the only unclassified government document which was admitting that Britain had had a computer during the war, but it was a letter which was denying my request to have it declassified.
There's somehow something about yes, minister-ish about that, isn't there?
Yes, there is indeed.
So where did it go from there? How did you come to? I suppose you gave this major talk, I understand, at Los Alamos about it in the 1976. People just obviously hadn't heard about Colossus at this point. Did you? Was that it? Did you leave it at that, or did you kind of lead it, talk about it more and more, lead a calls for it after that?
Yeah. I didn't do further investigation of Colossus myself after that. I went to the Los Alamos conference, and I arranged that one of the Colossus engineers, Doc Coombs, was there with me. I gave a quite lengthy lecture, which was quite a sensation. How could it not be? So much so that the organizer of the conference organized an evening session, a special evening session, at which Doc Coombs and I answered questions, or rather, he answered questions, and I tried to prevent him saying things that I knew he wasn't allowed to say.
What was the response? How would you describe the response and the reaction to what you and Doc talked about?
I think the technical term is gobsmacked. Nobody had ever heard of this machine. The fact that it wasn't just one computer, but by the end of the war, 10 computers, each containing a number of tubes, valves, fairly similar to the early real numerical type computers, because the Colossus, to call it a computer, it was a pretty special purpose machine, but which, for all of that, had an ability to be programmed, in a sense, through setting up of switches and plugged wires and so on, that made it a very powerful machine. And the fact that of something like that a few years before in total secrecy, and then kept secret for another 30 or so years, that was what startled people. And in the audience at Los Alamos, there were quite a few of the original pioneers, including people like John Mauchly, who previously thought that he was the designer of the world's first electronic computer.
So general consternation and shock all around from different people for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, and just about the whole conference turned up for the discussion session, which went on for hours.
You, of course, I believe it was your work. You had, through your efforts, Tommy Flowers received an honorary degree from Newcastle University. Was that? How do you feel? Why was that? Why did you do that? I suppose. How was that?
Well, Tommy,
is that an important milestone? Do you think,
yeah.
A necessary award?
Tommy Flowers' work was so important and was so unknown. He just had received so little recognition. I felt that was, so to speak, the least I could do. Initially persuading the relevant committee at Newcastle, I gather it discussed at some time whether what he had done was enough for a Newcastle honorary degree. I was very pleased when, after the honorary degree ceremony, when there were several degrees given to honorary graduates, the next day's Times newspaper carried a story in which his was the prominent award. And I thought, right, yeah.
Let's take a step back away from Bletchley Park and Colossus, because you've got a long and distinguished career. You're one of your, and part of the award is recognition for your great contribution to computing. I know you're excited by a particular project you've been working around a character not many people would have heard of, to be fair, Percy Edwin Ludgate. You're working on that. Just briefly, who is Percy Edwin Ludgate, and what's his contribution to computing? What are you hoping to, and what are you working on achieving there?
Percy Ludgate is the person who got me interested in the history of computing. When I arrived at Newcastle from the IBM Research Centre in the late 1960s, I had to give an inaugural lecture. I was looking for something interesting to say in the lecture, and writing about Ada Lovelace, I happened to find a document which was by somebody I didn't know, Percy Ludgate, which had a final paragraph which said something along the lines of, I too have designed an analytical, a Babbage-style analytical machine. And there were about 3 sentences. But there was enough there for me to find out more about it. And so my first foray into the history of computing was to write a paper about this by now completely unknown Irish pioneer who in the early 1900s, as far as we know, working completely on his own, designed the first machine after Babbage that was in any way comparable to Babbage's work. So that paper had been had written. That got me generally into investigating the history of computing. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, a little group of people led by a retired member of Trinity College Dublin have been investigating Ludgate, and I've been involved in that, and we've managed to find some more out about him, and have had a paper accepted for the Annals of the History of Computing.
So your passion really has become, I mean, like you mentioned there, you said you'd come to IBM, which we'll get to in a second, but you've definitely gone down a historical avenue here, haven't you? What is it about the history of computing that I suppose fascinates you?
When I've given occasional talks to students about the history of computing, I felt a need to defend why I'm doing it. And the reasons I tend to give are, 1, it's interesting. 2, I feel that in some sense we owe a duty to the people who originated in our subject to know something about them and to sort of celebrate their successes. I guess you might say it's also pretty good in pub quizzes, and basically it's fascinating. So as a sort of secondary research subject, the history of computing is something that I've enjoyed doing. I suppose there's another more important reason than any of the ones I just gave you with respect to telling about the students. The students are being taught computing at a given time, and to give them some idea of how far and how fast the subject has developed, prepares them for understanding that what they're learning at this moment is just a point on a continuum of further incredible progress. There might be a danger of them thinking, right, I've learned what I need to know about computing, that's it, now I can go and apply it all. No, they've got to be prepared for a subject which is, if anything, accelerating. So I think the only way to convince people of how fast a subject is likely to progress is to tell them a bit about how it's progressed so far to get where it is now.
You, of course, have a long history of working in computing. You worked for IBM Research in the United States on operating systems. Tell us a little bit about what you did there.
I started work there on a very secret project, which was an attempt by IBM to recapture the market for the fastest computer in the world. That had been, so to speak, taken from them by Seymour Cray and CDC, that computer company. Mm. So I worked for a year on a research project on that. Then that project, 12 of us moved across to the West Coast and created a new department, Advanced Computing Systems. And I was there for about a year, but then came back to research. That project went on for a couple of years, but then was cancelled and didn't really see the light of day for about another 20 years. But it was a very innovative project, even if it was one of the many IBM projects which didn't actually get to market.
Okay, and then you mentioned work on resilience and dependable systems as well, which I understand wasn't at IBM. What was that work?
Okay, when I was back at Newcastle, one of the things I was invited to do was to help with the first NATO conference on software engineering. I and Peter Nahr were asked to produce the report on the conference. During that conference, there was a lot of talk about the problems of developing complex software systems. And there was a lot of talk by a lot of people about how to produce correct programs. I decided that though that was a very good and very valuable task, it wasn't one I could contribute much to. And I took the rather cynical view that it would be interesting to see to what extent you could make systems reliable, despite the fact they still had faults in them. And that got me working on the subject of fault tolerance, which I guess now really is at the heart of what's called resilience. Mm-hmm. And that was a subject which I started working on with colleagues in about 1970, and which has gone on being relevant ever since.
Well, it certainly is today. Obviously, we're in an era of resilient computing, aren't we, with cloud computing? Yeah. So that's a very long and distinguished career, a very varied career there. So what's next for you, Professor Randell?
When I and others got interested in the subject of fault-tolerant software, we found we had to revisit the whole subject of formal concepts and formal definitions, just to understand the issues. That work has continued on, and to my surprise, has burgeoned again in the last couple of years at Newcastle, when I, with colleagues, have been doing work on failure analysis, how to understand the notion of failures having causes and designing software which might help with that analysis. But in fact, we've taken that work very generally and have been applying it not just to computers, but also subjects like crime investigation. You can think of a crime as being a failure, and a failure having causes, the nefarious acts of various criminals. And investigating a crime can be rather like understanding why a very complex computer system has stopped working. That's a long stretch, but in fact, the underlying theory has a close link. And so that's the sort of work I and a little group have been involved in for quite a few years.
Well, once again, it's been great talking to you. Thank you, Professor Randell, and once again, congratulations on the award.
Thank you very much. And my thanks to the National Museum for providing me with this really very nice souvenir. And certainly my best wishes to the museum for their continuing efforts. I'm really quite proud of that museum.